Patricia Cole had been interviewing musicians for 7 years when she sat down with Marvin Gaye in the spring of 1971. She had done her preparation. She had one question she had been saving for the end. He answered everything she brought. The last one he would not answer. She has thought about it ever since. The interview took place in May 1971, 6 weeks after What's Going On had been released. The record was selling. The radio stations were playing it. The conversations about what it meant, politically, musically, as a statement about what popular music was permitted to do, were beginning in the music press and in the spaces where the music press mattered. Patricia Cole worked for a black music publication in Detroit. She was 29 years old. She had come to the work through a specific conviction that the music being made by black artists in America in the late 1960s and early 1970s was one of the most important cultural documents being produced anywhere, and that the coverage it received in the mainstream press was inadequate to its actual significance. She wrote about it with a precision that this conviction required. She had interviewed enough major artists to know that Marvin Gaye was going to be different. Not because of his fame, she had interviewed people as famous or more so, but because the record he had just made was a particular kind of record, the kind that raised specific questions about the relationship between what an artist makes and what an artist knows about themselves. She wanted to ask those questions. She prepared carefully. The interview itself was remarkable by her description. Marvin was attentive and specific. He did not deflect in the way that public figures often deflect, turning questions into stories about other questions, converting the personal into the anecdotal. He answered what she asked. He was generous with the complexity of it, willing to sit in the difficulty rather than resolving it prematurely. She took notes quickly. She asked about the album's origins. She asked about the brothers' letters and what it had meant to receive them. She asked about Gordy and the standoff and what it had required to hold to the position. She asked about Tammi Terrell and what the years after her death had been. He answered all of it. He answered with a directness that she had not fully anticipated, not performing vulnerability, simply accounting for what had happened in a way that left room for the full weight of it. She was writing as fast as she could. At the end, she asked the question she had been saving. She asked, "Is there anything you made on this album that you are not able to listen to?" Marvin Gaye looked at her. The pause lasted long enough that she thought she had broken something in the room. Then he said, "Yes." She waited. He said, "I am not going to tell you which one." She did not press. She was experienced enough to know that pressing in a moment like that does not produce the answer. It produces a wall, and walls are less useful than silences. She closed her notebook. She thanked him. She left. She wrote the piece. It was one of the better pieces she wrote in her career. Specific, attentive, doing what the music had done, holding the difficulty without resolving it. She did not include the final exchange in the published version. She held it. She published it in June 1971. It was read widely in the community that read that kind of publication. It did not make her famous in the way that covering famous people does not always make the person covering them famous. It was simply good work, carefully done. She spent the following years returning, occasionally, to the final question and the answer. She tried to identify which track it was. She listened to the album with that question in mind. She had theories. She held them loosely. She never got another interview with Marvin Gaye. She covered his career through the 1970 seconds, through Here, My Dear, and Let's Get It On, and the Belgium period. She heard Sexual Healing when it came out and understood it as the record of someone who had been doing exactly what he had said, holding something he had made that he could not fully listen to, and trying, across a decade, to find something that could address it. He died in 984. She heard about it and sat for a while with the notebook from the 971 interview, which she had kept. She read through it. She came to the final exchange. "Is there anything on this album you are not able to listen to?" "Yes. I am not going to tell you which one." She never figured out which one. She carried the question for the rest of her working life. Some things only the person who made them fully knows. That, she eventually decided, was the answer he had given her. In the decades following the interview, Patricia Cole's fascination with that single yes evolved into a meditation on the nature of artistic creation. She realized that the barrier between the creator and the creation is not always porous. Sometimes, the art is a barrier in itself, a structure built specifically to keep the truth from being entirely consumed. She began to view the album What's Going On not just as a collection of songs, but as a map of Marvin's internal trauma. If he could not listen to a specific track, it was likely because that track was the place where the anesthesia wore off. It was the point where the art stopped protecting him from the reality of what he was describing. Patricia grew to respect the silence he maintained. She realized that by refusing to name the track, Marvin was actually granting her a deeper truth than a title ever could. He was acknowledging that there are parts of the human experience, grief, shame, the specter of war, the betrayal of a father, that cannot be fully transcribed, even by a genius. By keeping that secret, he preserved the mystery of the work. He ensured that the album remained a living thing, one that could reveal different truths to different listeners, rather than being fossilized by a single, definitive confession. She often wondered if the song in question was "God Is My Friend," or perhaps the title track itself, with its haunting, cyclical return to the question of existence. Was it the song about the war? Was it the song about the environment? Or was it something deeper, something tied to the guilt of being the one who returned home while his brother was in the mud? She had her theories, but they were always just that, theories. She eventually stopped searching for the right answer. She learned that the mystery was a necessary component of the listening experience. To solve the mystery would be to diminish the album's power. The notebook became an anchor for her. As she navigated the shifting landscape of 1970 seconds journalism, the rise of corporate media, the commodification of celebrity, she kept that notebook as a reminder of a different time. It reminded her of an era when an artist and a journalist could sit in a room and engage in a dialogue that was grounded in the work, not in the image. It reminded her that the most profound insights are often the ones that are never published. When she thought about Marvin, especially in his later, more volatile years, she didn't see the tabloid image. She saw the man who had looked at her across a table in 1971 and admitted to a vulnerability he couldn't even name to himself. She saw the man who had been brave enough to create a masterpiece, but who also recognized that the act of creation carries a price. She didn't pity him. She didn't judge him. She simply admired the courage it took to stand in front of the mirror of his own art and admit that he didn't like what he saw in every single reflection. There was a profound, quiet grace in that admission. Most artists, when confronted with the question of their own work, will praise it, defend it, or contextualize it. Few will admit that their work possesses the power to hurt them. Marvin's honesty in that moment was an act of profound intimacy. He was telling her that he was not immune to his own lyrics, that he was a participant in the experience of his music, not just its architect. As she reached the later stages of her own life, Patricia began to see the answer differently. She realized that the song he couldn't listen to wasn't necessarily a bad song. It was simply a true song. It was the song that held too much of his soul for him to handle in his daily life. It was a mirror that was perhaps too sharp, too clear. She realized that we all have those moments, those experiences we create or endure or witness, that we cannot fully inhabit again without being undone. Marvin Gaye had simply been the one to put his undoing on vinyl for the world to hear. The tragedy of his death in 1984 only amplified the significance of that exchange. It made the question feel like a premonition. Had he been holding on to that secret, that one track, for 13 years? Had that one piece of music been the pebble in his shoe, the constant reminder of a reality he couldn't escape? It is a heavy thing to contemplate, the idea that a man's greatest work could also be the source of his most profound inability to find peace. Patricia's career was defined by many interviews, many profiles, and many stories. But that one exchange became the bedrock of her professional identity. It reminded her that her job wasn't to extract confessions. It was to hold space for the truth to emerge, even if that truth was a refusal to answer. She understood that silence is not the absence of communication. It is a communication in its own right. It is a boundary, a protection, and a declaration. When people asked her about her best interview, she didn't talk about the celebrities or the scandals. She talked about the man in 1971, the man who had looked her in the eye and said, "No." She realized that she had been granted a seat at the table of a genius, and that the greatest gift he gave her was not an answer, but a question she would carry for the rest of her life. She was the guardian of a mystery that belonged only to him, and that was more than enough. The music industry would eventually move on, the trends would change, and the technology would evolve. But the integrity of that 1971 conversation remained static. It was a moment captured in time, like a photograph of a room that no longer exists. She knew that even if the song was eventually identified by someone with access to his private archives, it wouldn't change the nature of the truth. The truth wasn't in the identification. The truth was in the refusal. She walked through the world with the weight of that silence, and she found it to be a comfort. It reminded her that no matter how much we think we know someone, especially an artist, there is always a core of their experience that remains unreachable. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of all. We can listen to the music, we can analyze the lyrics, and we can study the history, but we can never fully inhabit the place where the artist was when they made it. Patricia Cole eventually retired, leaving behind a body of work that was respected and remembered. But in the quiet moments of her final years, she didn't look back at the magazine covers or the awards. She looked back at that notebook. She looked back at the spring of 1971, the sound of the city, the heat of the afternoon, and the way Marvin Gaye had looked at her before he said, "I am not going to tell you which one." She knew then that she had been part of a human mystery, a story that was incomplete by design, and in that she found her peace. The music remained, the notebook was closed, and the secret stayed exactly where it belonged, in the space between the man and his art, forever protected, forever untold, and forever true.